participating in our events that we sponsor here at the Tempe History Museum in this beautiful community room. And of course, you're here because you have a purpose. You want to learn something about people, places, things, and events that have occurred that affect your life, whether you're a youngster, or whether you're middle-aged, or whether you're retired like me, although I keep flunking retirement. I am a professor emeritus, Arizona State University, historian, archivist. I meet with students often who want to learn something about the West, but then they narrow the topic down. They want to learn something about Arizona. So I get that question, what do you know about Arizona history? Oh, that's like asking me, what do you know about the world? I don't know. Be specific. So finally, we get down to the bare bones that they want to learn something about Maricopa County. They narrow it down. They want to learn something about Tempe. And they want to learn about the groups that have built our little community, which is no longer a small community or a little community. We're no longer a farm town here. We're a city that attracts diversity, a city that brings in new people, a city that students can write about in different ways. Because we have here at the Tempe History Museum and here next door a library that is rich and full of materials and artifacts and photographs and memorabilia and ephemera, materials about the people, places, things of Tempe that persons can come here and read and write about and study, and it's all available and it's all free. So you don't have to be a student. You can be a person who is writing something. You can be what we call a history enthusiast. That's a kind word that means enthusiast and not buff. You see the difference if I call you a history buff or if I call you a history enthusiast? History buff, history enthusiast. You grow in status when you become an enthusiast. So you are all history enthusiasts of Tempe. And I recognize that in all of you, and I thank you for being here because that means we have something in common. So today, I hope that you are able to pick up some of our flyers that tell you about people, places, things, and events. I do want to call your attention to this wonderful display of photographs that are being shared here in the community room by the well-known photographer of Phoenix, of Maricopa County, a very well-known photographer whose name is Jose Munoz, M-U-N, with the tilde, Munoz, Jose Munoz, very well-known photographer who has been documenting the history of Mexicanos, Mexican Americans, Chicanos, Latinos, Hispanics of Maricopa County, no matter where we have been, what we have done, the events, the excitements that we bring through our culture, our language, our history, our diversity. He is there at your wedding, at your baptism, at your funeral, at the cemetery, at your birth certificate, at your communion. Jose Munoz has documented the history of us. And here we have in the community room some of his photographs and depictions of art relating to his photographs. So I hope you have an opportunity to see. You'll see photographs that are very rare. When Cesar Chavez passed in 1992, he was there to document his funeral. And so you see here, among the photographs, the funeral services that were held in Delano in California in 1992 when Cesar Chavez passed. You do see in the photographs the very well-known photograph of famous workers and people, the Lourdes Huerta and the Carrie Kennedy, who was here when Cesar had his fast in 1972 in Phoenix. It was a 72-day fast, and Cesar Chavez was fasting to document and to remind folks of a labor strike that was occurring related to farm workers who wanted to form a union but were not able to. So he had his fast, and the Kennedy family came. Ethel came with the children. And one of the photographs that Jose Munoz has taken is a photograph of Harry Kennedy with Dolores Huerta at the funeral service of Cesar Chavez in 1992. And you'll see other photographs that relate to farm workers, and that is because we have here in our exhibit area the very well-known exhibit that relates to the history of the farm workers and Cesar Chavez that has been curated by our curator here, Marco Albarran, and others. So there are a lot of things that you can see here. We have exhibits that reflect the history of Tempe. We have exhibits that reflect the history of Cesar Chavez and the farm workers. We have our photographs on display by Jose Munoz. So there are a lot of things that occur here because you represent this place and you are of this place, because you are also here as our sponsor, Friendship Village, of our lunch talks. So please do bring and pick up, rather, our brochure that describes our series, which we just kicked off last month. Every month we have a speaker who is fascinating, who brings attention to the things that we probably don't know. Today we have a wonderful speaker, but before I introduce our speaker, who is going to be Mark Vinson, who is going to speak, I want to introduce you to your friend and our friend, because Friendship Village does sponsor these lunch talks. So I want to bring forth someone that you probably know, and I want to introduce Mark Evans. Mark?
It's okay, my last name's Young.
Mark Young.
Hey. Thank you, Doctor. These are so important to the residents at Friendship Village, these lunch talks, that there's no way that we would leave this off, right? This is something that we proudly sponsor. We love doing this. And selfishly, I've been living here since 1974, and I learn some things every time I come. So I love coming to these. I know the residents of Friendship Village does, and we're just very proud to be a part of this. If anybody has not heard of Friendship Village or wants to learn more about Friendship Village, I will be here throughout the duration. At the end of the show, at the end of the talk, I will be in the back, and just come on up and ask me questions. So thank you very much.
I correct my error, Mark Young. But I do want to introduce, and you do have your brochure here, I want to bring forth a very well-known architect in our community. I learned today that he is from a mining town like me. I'm from the Globe Miami area, and we say Miami, not Miami. But he's from Clifton, Morenci, and we spoke of different kinds of activity that took place in mining towns. Labor strikes occur, of course, flooding that does occur, and also labor strikes that affect the lives and the people. And importantly, there are some landmarks in the Clifton-Morenci area that are very important, not only because they relate to that 1983-85 strike of Clifton-Morenci, but also Mark has been able to document and preserve landmarks in Tempe. So if you read the brochure, I want to say that Mark is here, Mark Vinson, The Emergence and Evolution, a Celebration of Tempe Architecture. I do want to say that he's been very, very good and very helpful in helping us here work with the preservation of the Peterson House and do some additional work regarding to a structure or two to add to the Peterson House. The Peterson House is one of the buildings or one of the homes that has been preserved and is very important, but Mark has been very, very important in helping us preserve that as well. So Mark, would you like to come up and give your presentation?
Thank you, Christine. I want to give her some love too. She's amazing. So I appreciate you, Christine. Well, as she mentioned, I'm from Clifton-Morenci, but I got to Tempe as soon as I could at the age of 17. Went to Arizona State University, majored in architecture, went to work in private practice for a few years, and then one of the great blessings of my life was I got hired by the City of Tempe, and I worked for them for many years as planner, later on city architect, historic preservation officer, and then the last 8 years have been able to practice private practice architecture as a VinsonStudio. So I'm still enjoying a career in architecture, and a lot of it was made possible because of the city of Tempe and all the folks in Tempe. So I really appreciate that. And I know it's all right. I thought the mothership was coming in to take me away. So anyway, I know most of your speakers are very scholarly and serious, and today you're going to be stuck with somebody that draws with colored pencils for a living. So we'll just try to make the best of it, and I'll share a little bit of knowledge. And I'm fully expecting that there is more knowledge in this room, certainly, than what I have. I know a little bit about a lot of things, but I'm sure there's going to be at least one person, if not more, in here today that will know more than I do about any particular thing. So it'll be fun afterwards to talk about that and share some information. So what I like to do when I talk about architecture anywhere, but especially in Tempe, is to kind of break it down into certain eras, because things don't always just happen in a linear progression. They happen within sort of little passages of time that I'm calling eras. And these are the eras that I've recognized in Tempe architecture. We have the indigenous period, so that's basically prehistoric up until 1863. The early settlement, which is also the early territorial period, 1864 to 1879. And I should stop and mention that each one of these eras is basically defined by either political or technological happenings or advancements, and that kind of defines the era. It's not, the architecture responds to the era. It doesn't necessarily create the era. But going on, then we have late territorial, and we'll talk more about what those are as we go through the presentation. Early statehood, obviously 1912 to 1929, Depression and War era, the Great Depression and World War II, 1930 through 1945. Mid-century, you hear that phrase a lot these days, mid-century modern, and we'll talk a little bit about what that's all about. And that usually gets defined as 1945 to 1975. I'm a little bit different. I go 1946 because things didn't really start happening until, a year after the war was over. And then they kind of ended in 1973, that particular era did, coincident with the Arab oil embargo and some of the effects that had. But anyway, after that, then we get into the late 20th century and then post-millennial from the year 2000 until the present. So we'll look at some examples from each period, and we'll start off with indigenous. And indigenous means having to do with a particular place or drawn from a particular place, be that materials, people, culture. And vernacular just means architecture that's not designed by trained professionals, although there may be skilled craftspeople involved, but they're building from their own sort of cultural norms, and that's what shapes the architecture in addition to responding to the environment and the materials that are available. This I always think is interesting. If you look at these two maps, on the left is the kind of the geographic layout of the state, the plateau, the mountain, and the desert regions. And when you look at the map on the right, are we reading that the same way? Okay, yes. And you just look at the Arizona portion of that map, and you see that it corresponds almost exactly to the geographic regions. And so we have the Anasazi, or as they're now known as the ancestral Puebloans, up in that plateau area, the Mogollon culture through the mountainous region, and the Hohokam in the desert region. So it's an interesting thing that shows how cultures respond to the landforms and the climates. And of course, the first culture that built anything in Tempe is the Hohokam. And their technological achievement, which is a fantastic one, was their system of canals, irrigation canals. And we see a few remnants of that culture today, mostly so in the people that are here to this day, as represented by the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community and the Gila River Indian community. But they actually left behind something in Tempe, an actual structure that is near the Tempe Town Lake, a small pueblo consisting of about 4 rooms with some exterior activity spaces, and this has been documented by archaeologists, and that's kind of a very speculative rendition of what it might have looked like at one time, and then covered up to protect it from vandalism, which unfortunately is a thing that we have to deal with. But so that exists today, and we see the evidence of that culture. Then we get the early settlement, the early settlers, the Mexican-American settlers, Anglo settlers, all coming into this area beginning beginning after 1863. So what happened in 1863, 1864? Arizona became a territory, and there were army forts established, and of course the capital was in Prescott, but a fort was established at Fort McDowell, and some enterprising individuals were able to come in and actually re-excavate some of those Hohokam canals, start growing vegetables and grain, selling it to the Fort McDowell. And that is really how modern Tempe began, with those folks doing that. And then this entrepreneur from Tucson, a freighter that we're all familiar with by the name of Charles Hayden, kind of saw this activity and decided this might be a good place for a mill. And I think we all know that story. But the one thing that bound all these people together was their use of materials, and we talked about the previous indigenous period. Well, this is really just a continuation of that, because there were no readily available materials other than what was here, building out of adobe with logs and vigas and latillas for ceilings, and we see that in Hayden's original flour mill at the top on the left. That's actually Nils Peterson's original home out of adobe before the Victorian house was constructed. On the upper right, the Elias Rodriguez house, built in, we know for sure by 1890, but maybe as early as 1882. And it was originally a flat-roofed adobe structure. A hip roof was added later. And the adobe lounge, I'm not sure how that got in here, but actually it is fired adobe. It was constructed out of fired adobe, and I don't know if anybody remembers that. I'm thinking it was out on West Broadway. And it was barely there when I first came to Tempe. But with the Mexican-American settlement, those folks settled in different areas of the community. Those neighborhoods evolved, or barrios, as they're also called. And here's an example of one. The photograph is of the Barrio de la Cremeria. So this was along 8th Street, the Bankhead Highway, which was actually the main highway between Tempe and Mesa. So at the bottom of the picture would be Rural Road, and so you're looking east along the Bankhead Highway towards Dorsey at the top of the picture. And at the top left, you see the creamery, the Borden Creamery, and then the barrio strung out along the south side of the road, and then south of that is a canal, an irrigation canal. So that's one of the early settlements of Tempe. Charles Hayden, when he built his home, he hired his Mexican-American workers to build the house, and they built the kind of house they knew how to build, which was from the Sonoran vernacular tradition, a Sonoran row house, and using adobe and vigas and latillas. And we see some early photographs of that with surrounding a courtyard with the fountain in the center. And of course, I'm sure many of us here remember the Montes era of the structure, and can fondly remember consuming vast quantities of Roman bread and other goodies there. So that was certainly an important era in the history of the building. And happily, the building has been restored now and is the home of the downtown Tempe community. One of the things to talk about in doing restoration work is you're going to restore a building, but this building has existed since 1873, and it's been through a lot of changes. What do you restore it to? And so the research and the discussion kind of centered on, well, it was its original significance had to do with the Hayden family. The Hayden family owned it at least up and through the 1920s. And in 1924, actually, they hired a professional architect and builder, Robert Evans, and we'll hear about him some more later, to quote unquote restore the house to the way it used to be, because at that time a second story had been added and other changes had been made. So he restored it as best he could to its original configuration and appearance, even though he made a few modifications. So that period in time was the point at which there was the most documentation available, and kind of marked the last time that the Hayden family had a major impact on the structure. So it was decided that that would be the target date for the restoration. So happily that all transpired. Then we get to late territorial, and by late territorial, how is that different than early territorial? Well, does anybody know what happened in Tempe in 1888? I heard railroad. That was it. So that was the major technological achievement that ushered in a new era of Tempe culture and architecture. Oh, let me back up a minute. So we for the first time, we start to see the development of actual preconceived styles, stylistic notions in architecture. We had Victorian and Romanesque, Gothic and Mission Revival, Western Colonial Revival, and others. But we'll see some of those as we go along here. Here's the famous Dyer bird's eye view of Tempe in 1888, and with little inset views of some of the prominent structures of the day. Well, only one of those structures still exists. So if you look at the bottom left hand, not the very corner, but the next one in, we will see, and look at the upper left hand corner again, the what we know today as the Hackett House, which was originally built as a speculative building by the Tempe Land and Improvement Company in 1888, and immediately sold to William Hilge, a German immigrant and baker, and he operated the Hilge Bakery. And unfortunately, Mr. Hilge ran into some difficulties and ended up taking his own life, from what I understand. But again, you had the building went through different eras of its own. It was acquired by the Hackett family in 1905, and was part of that family until 1974, when it was acquired by the City of Tempe. By about 1980, a new rehabilitation effort went into it, and it was restored at that time, and as we all know, has since been the home of Tempe sister cities. And happy to report that I'm actually working on a little project there, not on the main building, but on the rear building, the actual bakery building, restoring some things that have fallen into disrepair there. Well, the first building that we know anything of an actual architect being involved, the earliest date, excuse me, is the Peterson House, 1892, and the architect was James Creighton. And he designed many structures, not only in Tempe, but throughout the state, including Old Main at the University of Arizona, and another building of his in Tempe that we'll see in a minute. But he brought in the Queen Anne Victorian style, and Mr. Peterson, you saw his previous house of adobe, but he had gone back east and brought back a wife with him. And I don't know if this was meant to lure her here, or she put her foot down and said, I'm not living in that pile of adobe. You've got to build a real house. But either way, that's what he did. And we see some of the adaptations. I mean, this is, yes, it's a predetermined style, but look at some of the things like the high ceilings and the double hung windows. So of course, no air conditioning, but you could open a window at the bottom where there's a little bit cooler, and at the top where it's warmer, and get this natural air circulation going through. We see some of the balconies and of course the veranda that wraps around, and later on additions with a sleeping porch and other adaptations to this climate. So even though it's a style that was popular nationwide, there are adaptations to the local climate. Other buildings from that era we see, again, designed by James Creighton, the Andre building that you see at the top, actually under construction at that time. We see the 1903 Old St. Mary's Church, designed supposedly by the priest at that time, Father Severinus Westhoff, I believe, who was German, and he wanted a church that looked like things that he was familiar with from the Rhine Valley region of Germany. So he sketched out this layout that's kind of Gothic, kind of Romanesque revival, but happy that it's still standing today. In the center, we see the Atwood Hotel, which we now know as the Casa Loma, because it was Spanish colonialized in the 1920s and does not retain its original Victorian appearance. Bottom right, the creamery, the Borden Creamery, as it was originally constructed. I think the original parts of it built in 1888, and then kind of built out over a period of time. And kind of the main building that we see here that we now know as Four Peaks Brewery was built around 1900 in a Mission Revival style, and happily rehabilitated in the 1990s by Michael Wilson Kelly, architect. And here I'm going to talk about these buildings, but I'm really going to talk about another little dilemma in the preserving of historic buildings. So on the left we see Old Main at ASU, built in 1895. It was actually designed several years earlier by two architects, Fred Heinlein and W.A. McGinnis. I don't know much about them, except that I don't think they were local. But the building was designed, and then the funding was pulled by the legislature for some reason. There was some controversial thing going on, and so they didn't actually get the funding until a few years later in 1895 to build the building. Well, it went through a variety of uses. That entire center porch area was filled in during the 1950s. It was used for ROTC headquarters. The one thing that kept ASU from ever tearing this building down was the fact that the entire university telephone system was routed into the basement of that building. So that was the switchboard for the entire university. So they couldn't tear the building down. Well, happily by 2000, funds were raised to restore the building, and it's been used ever since as the headquarters of the Alumni Association. And on the right, we see the Governor Moore House that we may all be familiar with in downtown Tempe. What many people might not know is, as you see in the center photograph, it was originally built as a small Victorian cottage and added on to over time. It basically took on the configuration that we see today by about 1912. And then in the 1930s, the brick facing was added. It was originally just all wood frame construction. It was acquired by the city in the 1980s, and rehabilitated at that point. Some long forgotten city architect was involved, as well as again Michael Wilson Kelly as the architects. And in addition, not actually in addition to the building, but another building freestanding on the same site was designed to accommodate meetings and various events and functions. And so you see the dilemma between the two buildings. If you're going to do an addition to an historic building, you want it to be compatible yet distinct. In other words, it needs to be compatible with the original historic building, but you want to be able to tell it apart and not try to say, well, this was part of the original building when it really wasn't. So that's the two schools of thought. You can either be more distinct, like the addition to the back of the Old Main at ASU was, or more compatible, like the addition at the Governor Moore House was. I'm not saying one's right or one's wrong, but my personal preference is I would rather lean a little bit more towards the compatible than the distinct. But there we see the two approaches. Okay, early statehood. Obviously, Arizona became a state in 1912, and that ushered in a new era, not only in the state governance, but in architecture, and that also coincided basically with the rise of the automobile. So that's probably had the greatest impact on urban form of anything that has ever happened in Arizona or anywhere else for that matter. Whoops. So if we want to talk about some of the styles, now the previous styles didn't necessarily go away, but here we see the new styles that were introduced during that period. the bungalow style and primarily in residential architecture. We even saw some Egyptian revival. The biggie was neoclassical. Everybody wanted their building to look like the Greek classical buildings, and then there were some eclectic buildings that just kind of had a little bit of everything. One architect, he actually was trained as an engineer, but practiced as an architect and engineer in Tempe and Phoenix, was L.G. Knipe. And I wish Vic Lenoff were here because he's done more research than I have, and he knows how to pronounce the name, and I'm just guessing. So he designed as you see on the left bottom, the 1912 City Hall, the original City Hall for Tempe. And on the upper right, the Tempe National Bank building, which still exists today. The City Hall does not, because the 1970 City Hall exists on that property. But for someone trained as an engineer, he had a wonderful talent as an architect, kind of a master of different styles. On the upper left, we see Matthews Hall at ASU, which has a little bit of neoclassical, but also a little bit of prairie style. And of course, the Tempe City Hall was neoclassical all the way, and the Egyptian Revival Bank. And then the bottom right is, some people may remember this, unfortunately, this is what happened to that building in 1949 when it became part of the First National Bank organization, and it was thought that the building needed to be modernized. So that wonderful cornice was taken down. The Egyptian Revival detailing was either covered over or taken off. And I've seen the actual construction drawings from the 1949 project, and it just breaks my heart. There are actually notes on the drawing that say things like chip and remove arches, remove column here. And that's really too bad. And I wish I had a new slide of this, because it was purchased and rehabilitated by local architect Stu Seifer, happily, in the early 2000s, and still exists today. They weren't able to, capture all the original detail of it, but the basic forms and appearance were returned to its 1912, 1914 appearance. So a happy story there. E.M. White was a local farmer and businessman. Here's where the eclectic comes in. He built his own home on the north side of the river back around 1911, 1912, using local materials, river stone. He's got a little bit of Mission Revival, a little bit of neoclassical, and a little bit of I don't know what, all involved in the design of his house. And then he did the same thing with his dairy barn, which was not built next to the house. It was built down on what we know today as Apache Boulevard, basically Apache just east of McClintock. And it's gone through a number of iterations. We may remember it as Murphy's Irish Pub. Today it's the Tempe Tavern. And happily, some of the original features were kept in this sort of canopy. The dining canopy that you see out front was designed so that nothing actually attaches to the original building. So that could all be taken off, and you would still have the original facade of the building still there. So that's another approach in historic preservation. Well, here we see some examples of the bungalow, very popular in residential architecture at that time. The bottom right example is the best, the purest example, you might say, and that's the Sidney Moore House in the Ash Avenue neighborhood. On the left, the Frankenberg House that's on the campus of the Church of the Epiphany over on Price Road. It's got some other stylistic elements also, but a fairly good representation of bungalow. And now we look up above and we see the Moore House and the Peterson House again. And you're like, wait a minute, didn't you say the Peterson House was Queen Anne Victorian? Well, it is, but in 1930, after the Petersons had passed, and I forget if it was their niece or their nephew inherited the property. Somebody can help me out here. The nephew, okay. And he was a pastor, a local pastor. But anyway, they did some modernization to the house, and they took off the Victorian porch and put on a bungalow-style porch to bring the house up to date. So that's what we see today. And on the left, the Governor Moore House again, when it went through kind of its last major renovation in 1912. Again, what was popular at the time? Bungalow, not Victorian and not Western Colonial Revival anymore. So the porch takes on a bungalow styling. So we see that buildings are not necessarily static. They evolve over time, just as people do. So a couple of buildings at ASU that are neoclassical, the Gamage Hall, Dixie Gamage Hall, and what was originally the Industrial Arts Building. I think it's now Anthropology, I'm not sure. And that was another building that LG Kneip was involved with. Well, Depression and war, that's pretty self-explanatory of what was happening, what created this era. But a few things got built, and we do see Art Deco, Moderne, Pueblo and Spanish colonial revivals happening during that time period. We see the Moore Activity Center at ASU actually constructed of adobe, because during the Depression, and this was in the early 1930s, so during the Depression, materials were expensive, hard to get, but labor was not expensive. So they actually excavated the basement for this building and used that material to create the adobes to build the rest of the building. And it was designed by the Phoenix firm of Lesher and Mahoney in kind of what you might call a Pueblo Deco style. There's some elements of Pueblo, some elements of Deco, and the person, the young architect that worked for Lesher and Mahoney at the time, that kind of supervised the construction, was a gentleman named Kemper Goodwin that we'll hear a little more about later on. In 1940, we got the originally known as the College Theater, built by Red Harkins, and went through, well, it was in the Art Deco style, and most of us remember it as it is today, the Valley Art Theater. And how about a show of hands for who saw the Rocky Horror Picture Show there? A few of us. And happily, well, it went through many changes of ownerships. The Harkins family no longer owned it, but in the late 1990s, Dan Harkins repurchased the building, and through a labor of love, his advisors were telling him, no, you're not going to make any money on this. He said, I don't care, I want to do it anyway, and restored the building basically on the exterior to its 1960 appearance, and then on the interior, I think they were able to go back a little bit farther. So they were able to use also some changes in the building code that allowed them to do some things that were kind of alternative treatments that the code didn't necessarily recognize at the time. And we were able to assist in that. The Historic Preservation Office at the city kind of helped get that through the process within the city of Tempe. So very glad that happened. Then there was this wealthy widow from Chicago who happened to be of Jewish ancestry, and she wanted to come out and spend the winter with her friends in Arizona. And so the story goes, she was refused accommodations at one or more of the local resorts because of her ancestry. So she said, to heck with them, I'll build my own resort. And that was Rose Eisendrath, and she hired, remember this name, Robert Evans, a local architect and builder who was quite familiar with adobe, to design her own little resort on the hill in North Tempe. But over the years, it went through a number of changes. Rose only occupied the house for 6 years before her passing, unfortunately. And it went through a number of ownership changes, and by the 1970s and 80s was in a very deteriorated condition. I will say that there was an artist living in it, renting the facility, and a lot of people kind of disparage that person, but in reality, he was the only one that kind of kept this thing from totally falling apart. I mean, he did what he could and managed to at least keep it together somewhat. So through a very creative combination of funding and acquisition methods, and a partnership between the City of Tempe and the Rio Salado Foundation, the property was acquired, and rehabilitation did actually commence in 2010. I was involved. Robert Graham, Motley Design Group, was hired as the consulting architect, and by 2015 we had a grand opening of the Eisendrath House, and work continues on there even today because there were some things that weren't able to be taken care of in 2015 that are now being addressed. Some of the ongoing Adobe repairs that are still happening. One interesting thing, I don't know if you can see it too well in the center upper photograph, you see the living room of the house, and we wanted to retain the, it looks like the Viga ceiling, and they're actually used telephone poles. That's what Robert Evans acquired and used in 1930. And we wanted to retain those, but the upper level to be used as a deck or for any use, really, there was going to be too much weight, and there had to be something done, and the structural engineer came up with this unique system of kind of a tensile system with steel rods to spread the loads out and allow the ceiling to remain. So yes, you can see those, but they're not too distracting, I don't think. And what's great is that you see the original ceiling that had been covered over for many years. So very happy that happened. All right, now we get to the time that everybody's been waiting for, I'm sure, the mid-century modern era, because that's still very popular today. You see it in furniture and all sorts of art and other areas, but kind of an explosion of styles at that point then. It was like there was all this pent-up need for new buildings, new housing, and also a taste for new styles and what's new and exciting. So you get all these new styles like A-frame and brutalist, expressive, international, modernistic, neo-formalist, ranch, Route 66, Southwest shed, right in, and that's only a few of them. But we'll look at a few of those. And the first thing we see is the origins of the ranch house, which became the style of residential architecture during the mid-century period, and it even got applied into motels, and that became a whole thing. For the first time ever, Americans are really able to get out and hit the roads. Roads were being improved. Automobiles were now coming down in price relative to what people's incomes were. People were able to get new cars and hit the road and see new and different things, and the architecture reflected that. A lot of the commercial architecture along the roadways, the business owners wanted to have something that was kind of flamboyant or interesting or appealed to what people at least thought they might be seeing as they were driving through the West. And so we get things like our beloved teepees, which of course no longer exist. Actually, the Wigwam Lodge on Apache Boulevard. The Huddle Restaurant. Is anyone familiar with that at all? Well, apparently and correct me if I'm wrong, if anybody else knows, apparently it was at the corner of Mellon University, and it did not exist really for a long period of time. It was only there for a few years, but we see its style of architecture has come to be known as the Googie style because of the Googie restaurant in Los Angeles. I kind of lump it along with the teepees into a kind of a catch-all style called Route 66. It's like something you might see along Route 66. Then we get the Danforth Chapel at ASU, which is what would be called modernistic. In other words, it's kind of a modern take on more historical forms. So it's kind of like a little Romanesque chapel, but done in kind of a modern way. Then we get the international style. That was the big modern movement that came to the U.S. in the 1930s, but really took on new legs in the mid-century period. We get on the upper left the administration building at ASU, E.L. Varney, architect, 1950. Below that, the farm education building, 1962, again by E.L. Varney. The Wilson Hall and dormitory, and the name of the architect escapes me on that right now. And then even in residential design, we see the ranch house taking on some new forms that were influenced by the international style, and we see that in the Campus Homes neighborhood of Tempe. Then we get what's called expressive or structurally expressive. The international style was very clean and very crisp, but maybe also a little bit boring, and not all architects were happy with that. And plus, they were exploring new materials, and so we get these really wonderful structures that are called structurally expressive. So we see the old bathhouses in Tempe Beach Park, which were thin shell concrete in a hyperbolic paraboloid form. We got the Valley National Bank at Apache and Rural in a geodesic dome. Happily, at least the dome was saved and moved across, kind of rolled down the street and across the street. So it's still there, serving on the ASU campus. The TICO 2 apartments, I think now they're called the college apartments or something more generic like that, with what's called a folded plate roof. And this happens to be the drive-through bank at Tempe Center, with the suspended roof from the beams overhead, steel beams. And that was designed by a firm out of Los Angeles, Victor Gruen and Associates. Well, by 1963, we see something again very international style in the what was originally built as a sanitarium, tuberculosis sanitarium. Later on became a children's hospital, later on acquired by ASU, and may become the future site of the John McCain National Library. That's yet to be determined, but that's something they're looking at. But anyway, that was designed by the local firm of Michael and Kemper Goodwin. Michael is the son, Kemper is the father. Michael actually was still in architecture school at USC at the time this building was done. But there's an interesting story that fortunately I was able to get to know Kemper a little bit before his passing. And he said that when they first got the commission to design the building, they met with the state health department folks, and he came up with this design, but they didn't like it for whatever reason. So he had to go back and come up with a new design. But during that interim period, the whole administration at the state health department had changed. There was a complete turnover, and when he came back with his new design, they didn't like it. And they said, "We want you to redesign it." So he said, "Okay." Went back, waited a few weeks, pulled these drawings out of the drawer, went back and showed the new administration. They, "Oh yeah, that's exactly what we want." So that's what got built, and that's what's there today. Of course, the firm's most iconic building, and perhaps the most iconic building, perhaps with one exception in the city of Tempe, is their Tempe City Hall in 1970 in the inverted pyramid form, which was designed to not only be dramatic and structurally expressive, but also so that the building could shade itself and respond to the climate. So it's not just a glass box with flat sides, and it's also rotated 45 degrees to north-south to help, again, break up that sun. Michael designed a very unique home for himself over in the Shalimar neighborhood. Now happens to be the home of the Ching family. Andrew, former Tempe city manager, still lives there, but is now the city manager in Paradise Valley. Another local architect, T.S. Montgomery, designed his whole thing was that buildings should appear very substantial, like this building isn't going anywhere. But yet he still had a very creative flair and employed the structurally expressive theme to many of his buildings. We see a home in Shalimar on the upper left, St. Augustine's, there we go. St. Augustine's Episcopal Church in the center, the women's PE building, as it was originally called, now it's PE East at Arizona State in the upper right, and Our Lady of Mount Carmel, the 1968 version on the lower right. And he used a lot of concrete, brick, the materials basically that are the structure of the building are the materials that you see. So that's what we would call an honest expression of material. They're not covered over with anything or trying to be something that they're not. Another firm, I think their offices might have actually been in Scottsdale, but they did a lot of work in Tempe, was Cartmel and Rossman. They did the Armstrong Hall at the College of Law at ASU on the left, and Manzanita the tallest building in Tempe for many years on the right, which again happily has been restored and still in use by the university. Well, I talked about there was possibly one other iconic building in Tempe other than Tempe City Hall, and it started out with, of course, everyone's familiar with Frank Lloyd Wright. In fact, he's been dead 60 years or more. Yeah, at least 60 years. And most people today, if you ask them to name an architect, the one architect that anybody is able to name usually is Frank Lloyd Wright, unless they happen to personally actually know somebody who's an architect. Well, Mr. Wright was just about 90 years old. In fact, he was 90 in 1957, and he received a commission from the Shah of Iran to design an opera house on an island in the Euphrates River in Baghdad. And he produced this amazing design that you see in the upper left. And unfortunately for Mr. Wright, and I guess for the Shah, he was deposed the following year. And so that project never got built, went into the drawer. And in 1959, shortly before Mr. Wright's death, Grady Gamage, the president of what was now Arizona State University, it had just become a university the year before, and he wanted to do something that would, put us on the map and be a landmark and an icon for this new university. And he had met Frank Lloyd Wright, who by this time was spending the winters at Taliesin West in Scottsdale. And he approached him, and they had a meeting. He went up to Taliesin and talked about, this project that he had in mind. And then the meeting was over, and he went away. And supposedly, Wright remarked to his associates there, he said, "What a charming fellow, but he has no money." So, but Dr. Gamage was not deterred, and he was able to get some funding going, and came back to Wright and had at least enough to hire him to design the building. And ding, 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 remember the story of Kemper Goodwin? Well, Mr. Wright did the same thing. He didn't throw these drawings away from the Opera House in Iraq, and made some modifications, and you see the original concept for Gamage up above there. So the original concept was very much like the Opera House. Of course, that needed to have some value engineering done to it, and unfortunately, before it could ever get built, Mr. Wright passed away, Grady Gamage passed away, but eventually the funds were raised, and in 1864, construction began, which you see a photo of there, and resulted in the iconic structure that we all know today. I'm sure we've all experienced the wonderful acoustics, and beyond just the acoustics, it just kind of lifts your spirit to go there, and that's the power of architecture. That's what architecture can do, other than just merely enclose a certain amount of space. There's all kinds of stories about the design and the creation of this, but an interesting building that Frank Lloyd Wright designed in Tempe but was never built, that might have even been more amazing, if you can imagine that, was what he called the Oasis Project, or Pro Bono Publico, which basically means for the good of the public. And it was a new Capitol building for the state of Arizona. He felt that our Capitol building was old and outmoded, and Arizona was this dynamic young state and needed something, far beyond what they had. And so he did this initial design at no charge, but the legislature just couldn't deal with it. It was too far out, and they thought it was going to cost too much money, and it would have been actually near where the sanitarium building ended up getting built. But wouldn't that have been amazing? But one thing Wright did beyond the buildings that he actually designed was he was such a powerful figure in the realm of architecture, was that many architects, either if they didn't adapt his style outright, it certainly influenced their own style, and you're looking at one of them right here. But here are some buildings in Tempe that reflect that from that mid-century period, and we see the Fiesta Inn, 1975 by a St. Louis firm of Peckham and Guyton. As far as I know, they had no direct association with Wright or Taliesin, but they definitely picked up on that vibe, and also the local flavor, indigenous materials, the copper overhangs and other elements. They had concrete block custom made for the project by the Superlight Block Company here in Tempe, just as Frank Lloyd Wright did for the Arizona Biltmore in Phoenix. Then we see a building on the upper right that was not originally built in Tempe, but it ended up in Tempe, and that's a story unto itself. But the John and Sandra Day O'Connor house, constructed of adobe, but designed in a very Wrightian style by a local Scottsdale architect by the name of D.K. Taylor, who didn't do a whole lot here and is kind of a mysterious figure. No one knows too much about him, except that in 1958, when the O'Connors hired him, they thought that he had been an apprentice at Taliesin. And so what they really wanted was a house designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, but they were afraid that he would be maybe too hard to work with or too expensive or whatever. So they hired D.K. Taylor because they thought he was a former Wright apprentice. Well, it turns out he wasn't, but he certainly was able to pick up on the style and gave them what they wanted. Through a long story, the building was taken apart, moved to a site in Tempe up near the Arizona Historical Society Museum, and today is the Sandra Day O'Connor Center for Public Discourse. On the lower right, building by the Phoenix firm of Davini and Associates, you can see very definitely picking up on the Wrightian feel, and Nick Davini had been an apprentice for the final year of Wright's life, from 58 to 59 at Taliesin, so he had that direct connection, and the reason I know this is because he was my mentor for my early years in the profession. So I like to at least think I'm only one degree removed from Frank Lloyd Wright. Not that that makes me anything special, but that's where I get a lot of my influence. Other buildings we see from this period, we see Watson's Flowers, which actually existed before. The original part was built in the very early part of the Depression, but the part that we see today was added on and basically fleshed out in the 1950s. The A-frame Tempe mortuary. And I would mention Watson's Flowers would be called a modern style. The two buildings at the bottom were both designed by noted Phoenix architect, Al Beadle, and these are projects kind of from late in his career, but I think are some of the finest works that he ever did. On the left, I believe it's called the Southern Desert Medical Plaza, but Al Beadle was originally very much the international school of modernism, and everything very rectilinear and straightforward. And kind of late in his career, he discovered that he had a triangle and a circle template also on his drawing board, and hey, I could use these too. And his buildings took on some different shapes and configurations. Very cool works, I think. On the right, I don't know the name of it today, but it was I think a pediatrics office, and it's north of Southern and east of Price, so it's in that area that's kind of the forgotten part of Tempe, that's east of the freeway. Well, we now have worked our way up to the late 20th century, and again, a lot of those previous styles continued on, but some of the new things we see are neo-Sonoran, postmodern, corporate modern. I'll talk more about those as we go along, but these would all pretty much be examples of, you could call them postmodern, maybe even neo-territorial if you wanted to get fancy with it. But basically the idea is that architects by this time were getting kind of tired of modernism and feeling like it was a little too restrictive, and buildings should be a little funkier and have a little more fun and maybe adapt some elements from the past, but in a modern sort of way. So we see that happening at the Brickyard in the upper left. It used to be called the Gordon Biersch building. Gordon Biersch is no longer there. On the upper right, by the firm of Robertson Jones out of Phoenix. Yours truly did an initial conceptual drawing for it. On the bottom right, the 525 building, which in some ways is unfortunate because it replaced a very cool 1963 Western Savings Building. I don't know if anybody remembers that. It was in the neo-formalist style and kind of built up on a podium, but it had, I guess, outlived its usefulness in some ways, and the city acquired it. Actually, interestingly, the city acquired it because it had a drive-through window, and they thought, okay, we can redevelop this building, and that'll be our drive-through window for utility payments. But then all kinds of other factors came into play, and that didn't happen, and so the building was demolished, and the new structure built. But at least it reflected a new philosophy that, okay, it's going to have city offices in it, but let's push the city offices away from the street and develop a street frontage that is commercial, that opens out onto the street, that contributes to, the vibrant Mill Avenue feel, and gives, something for people to interact with and not just blank windows. So I'm very glad that that approach was taken. On the bottom left, you say, wait a minute, well, that's the Laird and Dines building, and we see it in its recreated Victorian form from 1893. But as many of us know, it got Spanish colonialized in the 1920s, and then in the 1960s, the entire Mill Avenue facade basically kind of got sawed off when the Mill Avenue was designated as part of the state highway system, and certain, rights of ways had to be adhered to and so forth. Happily, once US 60 went in, the freeway, that designation was removed, and now the building could be built back out to its original configuration, and there wasn't much left from 1893 except for the brick walls, so everything else that you see is a recreation. So that's a little bit of a dilemma in historic preservation. You're recreating it. That's not the original balcony and wood, but it looks just like the original. And so in some cases, maybe that's the best you can do. And that was, in fact, the best we could do here. To the left, you see the building that actually made this possible. And that's the new addition to the building, which is much larger than the original building. And because of the rents and so forth that the new building would generate, that was able to pay for the restoration or the recreation of the historic building. So what's that expression about? One hand does something with the other. So, there's different ways to do it, but you have to be creative sometimes in historic preservation. Other buildings that happened during that period, upper left, another building by Davini Associates. So we see a little bit of Wrightian, but a little bit of kind of desert modern. And this building was not designed by Nick Davini, the Frank Lloyd Wright apprentice, but designed by his apprentice, who happened to go to work for the City of Tempe the next year after designing this building. So it was originally Wells Fargo. I don't know if it's still United Bank or what it is today. On the upper right, we see the new art and architecture building at Arizona State, designed by the Hillier Group out of Princeton, New Jersey. Kind of postmodern. It's hard to really say what what style it is, but I would call it postmodern. Lower left, this kind of reflects the fact that there were a lot of schools in Tempe that were being renovated or added on to at this time. The population was rapidly expanding, and new students had to be accommodated. And so this is one example. This is the Carminati School, very nearby to here. And this is a gymnasium, and I'm sure there were other functions involved as well. Addition to the school done in the 1990s, I believe, by James Abel, a Tempe architect. On the right, the little Cottonwoods townhouse community at Price in Guadalupe. I think it's pretty cool, pretty funky. I guess you would call it postmodern because it's a modern building, but yet it brings in elements from previous eras and previous styles. It was designed by an architect by the name of Adolphe de Roy Mark out of Phoenix. Probably the most iconic, I like to kind of zoom in on what was the most iconic building from each era. So I think the most iconic building from this era is the Nelson Fine Arts Center at Arizona State, designed by Anton Predock, a world-renowned architect, actually based out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. But you could almost call this post-Pueblo. It's post-modern, but it's referring back to the Pueblo style of architecture, but in a very modern way. And he relates to different things that appeal to him about the Southwest, one being drive-in movie theaters. You see that wall of the building in the upper right that movies can be projected on, and the brick arches there relating to the nearby Gamage Auditorium, and the idea of entering the building going down like you're going down into a cavern with a cool spring that would be a welcome respite in the Southwest. One interesting problem they've had since then is the stucco on the building. The color was an integral color. In other words, the color was mixed right into the stucco. It wasn't just painted over when it was first done. And the color was picked because Anton Predock, the architect, hiked over to Tempe Butte, found a rock that he liked, and brought it back and broke it open, and that was the color inside the rock. And he said, "This is the color I want." And they were able to achieve that. However, nobody ever sees the inside color of the rocks on Tempe Butte, so nobody knows that that was the inspiration because it doesn't really look like Tempe Butte. And then the other problem is that over the years, cracks happen and things happen, and stucco has to be repaired. And I don't know if they lost the original formula for that mixture, but nothing, was ever able to match the original. So I do believe it's been painted over by this point. All right, now we're up to what we could call our current era, the post-millennial or neo-modern era of architecture in Tempe. Started off with a few little one-hit wonders by some long-forgotten city architect. But the only one I'm going to point out is the one that got away, and that's in the lower right-hand corner. And that was a design for a boathouse on Tempe Town Lake. And it's never been constructed. Maybe will be someday. Maybe it'll look something like that, or maybe it'll look completely different, which is the most likely scenario. But hopefully that will happen one day. And then we start to see, because land in Tempe is scarce and getting more expensive, buildings start getting taller. And of course, with the development of Arizona State University and downtown Tempe and the Tempe Town Lake, those were all prime factors. I keep hitting this thing. In buildings starting to grow up and out. But that initial wave of new high-rise and mid-rise buildings, I think was actually very nice and well thought out. The buildings were well positioned on their sites to allow for the best solar orientation possible. The different elevations of the building responded to their different orientations. The buildings didn't necessarily look the same on every elevation, and especially the buildings along Town Lake kind of responded to that. The water setting and their curvilinear facades and reflectivity worked well there. And even on what was originally the America West building on the upper right, you see that, again, that each side of the building is not the same because you have to respond to different climatic factors, the different directions that you face. The building on the left, I believe it was originally called Papago Gateway, has an entire system of louvers that can be adjusted depending on the solar orientation of the day. Some other buildings that happened that I think are quite interesting throughout the city. On the upper left, a new building built on the campus of I believe it's a chapel, and there are other offices and other elements as part of it, but on the campus of the Church of the Epiphany. To the right, this is actually Grady Gamage Jr.'s office building at the corner of 5th and College in Tempe. But again, some neat things happening with overhangs and parts of the building that can open up. And the west-facing side of the building has deep recesses and actually trellises for vines to grow up on. The bottom right, the Vale by Will Bruder, architect, very creative combination of townhouses and colors and some dramatic forms. On the left, I'm not sure what it's called now. It was originally the Tempe Decorator Center corporate, or TDC, corporate headquarters by the Architects Design Group, who brought in a design consultant to help develop the design, who is now standing before you, and again brought in some of that Wrightian feel. And then you might say, well, wait a minute, aren't there even more high-rises now that have happened over the last 8 years that are even, bigger and bigger and more noticeable than the ones that I've already shown? And I would say, yes, there are, but I've also learned that if you don't have something nice to say, you shouldn't say it. So I'm not going to say anything about those, but instead I'm going to focus in on a couple of projects that I think really define this era of architecture. One, probably nobody is familiar with other than people in the architectural community, but it's the offices of an architecture firm, Jones Studio. And they bought this piece of land about 8 years ago and designed and built their own offices. Very creative use of space and materials. And again, getting back to that old idea that, if you use concrete block, then let the concrete block be seen. If you use metal, let the metal be seen. Whoops, back up. So we just see some different aspects of that building. And again, looking at the iconic buildings of each era, this is the iconic building for the post-millennial era, and we have the Tempe Center for the Arts. And I hope that by now everyone here has been to some function there, designed by a joint venture between the local Tempe firm of Architecton, all ASU grads, I might add, and Barton Myers, an internationally known architect who had a lot of experience in performing arts centers. Well, on the upper left, you see Barton's original sketch for the layout of the Arts Center. And on the right, you see what his inspiration was. And this is the great house at Chaco Canyon National Monument in New Mexico. So not exactly Arizona, but at least he was picking up on the southwestern influence. And he felt like that was a good model to use for organizing different spaces and different functions. And again, with the idea that, using exposed concrete in this case and metal for the roof, and the metal that's used or the materials that are used are the metals that you actually see. They're not hidden. And the interior organizational scheme was that, there would be this, like a grand boulevard almost, that organizes all the spaces, and all the spaces open out into that space. And Barton's feeling was that people go to the theater to be seen as much as they go to the theater to see other things. So he wanted there to be lots of spaces where people could be out there and kind of see and be seen. And of course, the wonderful auditorium spaces that are within the building, and then all of that interior promenade then opens out to the town lake. So a wonderful, iconic statement for Tempe. So in conclusion, before I conclude, let me do a little trivia contest here. I'll give you a hint. This building was built in 1934 and demolished in 1963. Who knows what it was and where it was? No takers? Okay. Well, we looked at that Kemper Goodwin building. Remember the building that was originally the sanitarium? That is the building that replaced this building. This was the original sanitarium on that same site on North Tempe in the Papago Hills. And in fact, they built a new building behind this building so that this building could keep operating until the new building was ready. And then they demolished this building and built the parking lot. So this existed on what's now the parking lot for that building. But the reason I put this up there is maybe it would be nice and clean if we could conclude with, okay, there is a certain Tempe style of architecture, but there really isn't. I mean, here we've got Moorish revival in 1934, and yet in many ways it does respond to the climate and responds to different things. I think more than anything, if we were going to say what's the common factor of Tempe architecture, it's creativity, it's responding to the culture and the environment, even though it may get fanciful at times over the years, but taking this insightful, creative approach to architecture and expressing it in a wonderful way that enhances people's lives and isn't just something that encloses space. So I think if anything, that's the common denominator of what's really Tempe, what Tempe architecture is really all about. So with that, I thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. First hand I saw was this lady right there.
We do have a Q&A, a question and answer period, so
Okay.
don't leave yet.
You need the microphone?
I do want to say a few words. Did you want to end it here, Mark?
Fine, whatever you want to do. Do you need, if someone wants to ask a question, do you need to give them the
We'll
microphone?
get the question and answer.
Okay, so however you want to do that.
Right. I do want to call your attention to two leaflets that you want to pick up on your way out, because you can tour on your own, free, with no registration required, the houses that are mentioned in one of these or two of these leaflets that are available for you to tour on your own. This Visit Tempe's Historic Houses leaflet, for example, you can visit on your own the Hayden House, the Charles Trumbull Hayden House, which is, of course, going through changes even today, but it is available for your own self-guided tour, which is free, no registration. The Hayden House, October the 19th from 11 to 2. You can go on your own and visit the Charles Trumbull Hayden home. You can always visit the Elias Rodriguez House, which is open on Saturday, October 26th, and also in November 23rd from 11 to 2 at 927 East 8th Street. The Elias Rodriguez House is known for many reasons, because it did become one of the homes, Mexican-American family home, that has resisted the efforts to remodel or destroy or not even recognize a family among other Mexican families important to the history of Tempe in terms of the children who did become students and well-educated, families who did become very important in different ways to the merchants' development of Tempe. But it's the Elias Rodriguez House, opening October 26th and November 23rd, 11 to 2 for your tour. And then we have the Eisendrath House, Saturday, November 9th at 1400 North College, which is one of the homes here that is also going to feature on November 16th. The performance at the Eisendrath House, the Beth Liederman Trio, featuring Diana Lee. So you do have to pay a fee for this one, but you can come early. There are tickets available. So do pick up the flyer that mentions this performance that is also very, very popular. So do stop by and pick up these leaflets. I do want to call attention to some of the houses that Mark mentioned. For example, the Danforth Chapel on campus of Arizona State University, adjacent to the Memorial Union. The Danforth Chapel, established in 1947 by the Danforth family, which is a non-denominational home to faculty, staff, students, and the general public who did come to the Danforth Chapel after 1947, and even today used for different purposes. My brother was married in the Danforth Chapel. And other families, of course, have used the Danforth Chapel in different ways. Students today, even now, do use it for prayer and self-reflection. But it's the well-known Danforth Chapel, which is always open. Anyone can come and visit, non-denominational, but it had been used previously by different organizations to, of course, say and worship. I do call attention to the Danforth Chapel being used in 1992 after the death of Cesar Chavez. The Chicano Faculty and Staff Association and the Mexican-American student organization known as MECHA, M-E-C-H-A, the Movimiento Estudiantil Chicanos de Aztlán, MECHA, MECHA and the Chicano Faculty and Staff Organization at ASU did use the Danforth Chapel for a week after the death of Cesar Chavez to honor his memory. A priest came from the Newman Center every day for a week to say Mass for everyone to come and join and honor Cesar Chavez at the Danforth Chapel. So that did occur in 1992. Persons came from all over the state to honor and pay homage to Cesar Chavez during that week when the priest, Father Mark, came from the Newman Center to say the Mass for Cesar Chavez in his honor and memory at the Danforth Chapel. I also want to say that the Hayden House, the Charles Trumbull Hayden Home or House, served in many ways the students and faculty and staff of ASU, not only because they had those delicious steaks and potatoes and a very reasonable price if you wanted to go have steak whenever you wanted to, especially Friday night when that place was booming. Many students who lived in my dormitory worked at the Hayden House in different ways. They were waitresses. My friend back here who was with me, my friend Randall, was a waitress there at the Hayden House. She has wonderful memories being there. So the Hayden House is still very important to the history of Tempe because it is the home of among the founders of Charles Trumbull Hayden and how he was able to establish with others a strong presence of workers who did channel that ferry across the river. They also worked at the Tempe silo there. So the Hayden House is still available for your visit if you choose to do that. We also recognize Gamage Auditorium. Used to be Victory Village, if you recall what was going on there. Even after World War II, Victory Village was the home to so many families. And you'll recall the lines and rows of laundry or lines of clotheslines up and down that street that we now call Gamage Parkway, but now at one time was Victory Village, of clothes hanging on the lines there, on the clotheslines of families. But can you imagine living in Victory Village when it was 110 degrees? When there was no air conditioning, but of course swamp coolers. Swamp coolers were built into those little Victory houses like you wouldn't believe. They were just there. I don't know how people lived, but they did, didn't they? So we do have homes that are still available for your viewing and your visitations. We do recognize the landmarks that Mark was very, very well and very good at pointing out the homes that are still here in Tempe and the buildings that are still very much a presence to the history of Arizona State University. So it is that you see how homes have changed, how the structures of homes have changed, from adobe to concrete to now the families who did use the rocks and the pebbles and even those boulders to establish their homes and build those walls and their homes as well. And even the church over here on College and University, the Mexican church, which is sometimes known as a 1903 Catholic house or Catholic church, where there was a photograph here of those Mexican families there at the chapel at the Tempe Butte. So that church is still very important and is still there after all these many, many years. Danforth Chapel is still there. Gamage Auditorium is still there. Hayden House is still there. And of course, visit these historic homes that were featured here in this presentation. So now we have a Q&A. So if you have any questions, I'm sure you'd be glad to answer.
I can use that.
Anyone have a Q&A or a question? No? Oh, here we have here. Yes, sir. Come on back.
Can you hear me?
Okay, Rob.
Yeah. So I'm curious, and obviously you've had a history with the city of Tempe.
Wait a minute. You need a mic.
As a
Mike, wait, because folks in front can't hear you.
I need to get him on the live stream, though.
So you obviously worked with the city of Tempe in the past, and you have a sense of local government. Is it just luck that a community has forward-looking architecture, creative architecture, has a culture of adaptive reuse that honors our historical history through architecture? Is it just luck that a community gets good architecture, or is there something the community can do or local government can do to promote and inspire creative design and architecture solutions within the next chapter of whatever, wherever Tempe is about to go. Is that something that the government can nurture, or is it just luck that we have creative people in a creative place at the right time?
Well, it's a great question. I'm not going to deny that serendipity does come into play at various times, but perhaps Tempe is somewhat unique in its confluence of major university with its own architecture school, some visionary community leaders that stepped up to do the Tempe Town Lake, and that promoted the construction of the Tempe City Hall that we see today when there was opposition to it. In fact, that only passed the council by a 4-3 vote in 1967, from what I understand. And there were non-governmental champions. So you need champions. You need champions within the government, yes, but also citizen champions that remind the government that this is the type of city that we want. This is the type of creative atmosphere that we want to live in. And this, with no disrespect to other communities, but this isn't Glendale. This is Tempe. We want this to be about our thing. And as I said, it's not about necessarily a particular style, but it's about the creativity and the use of materials and the response to the local conditions and the climatic influences, which are even more important these days. So maybe I'm talking around it, maybe I'm not really answering your question, but I would say more than anything, you just need champions, whether they're from the private sector or within the city government. Harry Mitchell, for example, was a great champion for many
Mark,
years.
we have a question over here. Yes, ma'am?
Thank you. Mark, you mentioned you were a preservation officer at one point in your career. Could you mention a little bit about what that office does in terms of preservation, and then add to that the current opportunity for folks to vote for the proposition number 2 in preservation here in Tempe?
Yes, well, that's another good one. So I was the first historic preservation officer for Tempe and helped write the ordinance that is used today. But that program's been taken, far beyond my original involvement. But it can only do so much. It's empowered by the Tempe Preservation Ordinance, but it takes, again, citizen movement to get things nominated onto the Historic Register of Tempe, and that's when they come under the purview of the Historic Preservation Office. Being that it is within the government, so to speak, that Historic Preservation Officer can only do so much. They're only empowered to do so much, and if they go beyond that, it might not be good for them. But having said that, again, if there's support from the top, that's a very key element. And then you mentioned, I didn't know the number of it, so it's Proposition 2? Is that? Okay. And that's a bond, right? That's on the upcoming. So I don't know that I can, lobby for anything in particular, but we'll point out that there is a bond on your upcoming election that would fund many historic preservation projects and would allow for the continuation of ongoing restoration efforts as well as new ones. So I just put that out there, and thank you for bringing it up. And speaking of champions, here's one right here's a couple right
have a
here,
question here
and many in
as
this
well.
room. I think there are many champions in this room. So I'm applauding you all for everything
Question here,
that
Mark.
you've done.
I was really excited to see a couple of examples in the Shalimar community.
Fine.
And I think we're in a time now where we're approaching questions about the preservation of mid-century modern era. So can you just advise us, how would we, Shalimar is kind of, the golf course is being challenged right now. So how should we think about the preservation of master plan communities, lifestyle, amenities, things like that, from the mid-century.
Yeah, that's, on the national level, that's just starting to really be recognized by the National Register of Historic Places, the value and significance of mid-century architecture and communities. And on the local level, I think it's kind of the same thing. It's just like all of a sudden, wow, things are, basically something has to be 50 years old or more before it's even considered for historic consideration. But now that's anything before 1974. And it brings a lot of these communities into the realm of possibility. So Shalimar's a great example. For something really to go forward, it needs a lot of support from within your local community, from within the neighborhood. You can contact the city's historic preservation officer, talk to them about how to maybe proceed. The city also has a neighborhoods office that can provide assistance in contacting neighbors and so forth. So, yeah, before anything happens politically, there has to be a great demonstration of support from within that either neighborhood or property owners. So let's start with your neighbors and also with the historic preservation officer. But yeah, a lot of Shalimar would definitely qualify, and it kind of depends on how much is original, how much has been changed, and there are other neighborhoods that have that dilemma also. But I appreciate the question, and I don't know that I've given you a really good answer, but Oh, there we go.
Any other questions? Well, we thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming, and we appreciate your interest in Arizona history and Tempe history. And I thank you very much, Mark, for being here and for your presentation. So we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.